Welcome back, Sleepyheads, and thanks for tuning in to another episode of Sleepy Aliens Perspective. I'm your host, H. Lee, and this is my third time, actually maybe my fourth time recording this. For some reason, I was having some microphone interference with a microphone that has not even fallen or been damaged in any way, so the spirits that be are trying to get me. So, round 3, let's get into it. To understand the Epstein saga and institutional cover-up of child ST in America, we really have to examine history. And I believe a critical point in history, or critical period, are the 1970s through the 1990s. So I'm going to be going into some different historical moments that really showed how this problem was starting to grow and spread. And I hope this can give us a deeper perspective of how we got to this Epstein saga. So I want to start in 1918. Don't get concerned, it's very brief. So prior to 1918, before all states made it a legal requirement that children attend school, there were children working in factories and mines doing 12-hour shifts. And most of the time, these kids are being paid very little. And they were being subjected to God knows what kind of behavior from adults. So this historical truth highlighted the long-standing practice of children being a resource for institutional, societal, and elite status development. And aside from, the PDF files and the sadism, at the core of so much of why we have this issue is money. And if we want to look at money on, I think, a spiritual plane, it's energy. It's energy. And at the end of the day, this is all spiritual warfare, and being able to drain someone of their, material resources drains them of their spiritual resources in a lot of ways. Anyways. So no, children in America, I can't say, during the Industrial Revolutions, and we had 2 major Industrial Revolutions in America, I can't say that they were slaves. Some of them could have been. I really can't say for sure. But most of these kids just knew that they had to help support their families. A lot of them were being forced into labor, and a lot of them understood how vulnerable poverty made them. And I talk about poverty so much because elites need poverty to sustain their lifestyles and to be able to commit the kind of crimes that they do against children. So really, poverty is why these kids were working these 12-hour shifts at such young age. I'm talking like 6 years old, 7 years old, being in these adult environments, handling adult concepts, having to put that kind of physical intensity on their bodies. So that is really the roots of the workforce. And I think it's interesting when you think about that in conjunction to where we're at now and, how children ended up, being on the streets and selling themselves. So I think just as difficult as it is to rid America of its deeply embedded white supremacy roots, I think it's equally as difficult to rid America of its long-standing history and tendency to exploit children for financial gain. So we can honestly say that there's always been chaos in America, but I, again, want to focus on that chaos of the 1970s through the 1990s, particularly to like the mid-1990s. So sure, at this point we know kids are going to school, and we know that the economics in America are really booming with science, tech, sports, and the entertainment industries, but at the same time, there was also high inflation, there was high unemployment. There were multiple recession periods that took place between the 1970s and the 1990s. And there was also the government-orchestrated crack epidemic that led to fractured families, mass incarceration, increased poverty rates, overburdened social welfare systems, and worst of all, increased rates of houseless children and child S workers. I mean, I'm talking, there was projected to be, at least at one point in the 1970s, over 100,000 boys and girls selling selling themselves on the streets to PDF files of low and high social statuses. And based on some of the periodical searches that I've done and the books that I've read, some of those children are as young as 8 and 9 and 10 years old, if you can imagine that. And the atrocities beyond, just these kids having to live that way and what they subjected themselves to survive is just the tip of the iceberg. Because, if you think about individuals like the Candyman in Texas, who was, snatching up kids, and John Wayne Gacy, who also was doing the same thing. But at the same time, there were kids selling themselves, being lured into these men's spaces, and being subjected to torture and snuff films and everything else, you don't want to imagine. So the vulnerability of a child in poverty is truly incalculable. And I believe that those in power not only perpetuate this issue, but, they need it so they can exploit children. And children selling themselves on the streets, even back in the 1970s, was projected to be $1 billion market. So that includes the PDF rings, the child porn, and the snuff films. So these children were being labeled by law enforcement and social services as runaways or throwaways. The runaways were escaping childhood SA, they were escaping ancestral SA, emotional or physical harm. The throwaways were more than likely going through the same thing, but ultimately they were just being dejected, from their families. And for maybe voicing concern, for maybe standing up for themselves, for maybe, asking someone outside of their household for help. There's just so many scenarios that is very hard to imagine in which, a parent just kicks their child out. And maybe these kids were acting up, but kids don't act up for no reason, right? I mean, there's something going on. And I think it says so much about our society if the fact that we have parents who can't get a child through the period of being 1 years old to 18-year-old and helping them, make it through that time period, giving them tools and love, and you don't have to give them all of the wealth and all of the things in the world, but teach them what you can, give them that protection and listen to them. And hopefully by the time they do reach 18 years old, they have some sort of foundation that can carry them on in their lives. But it baffles me. It just baffles me how so many people, have kids, continue to have kids, and shouldn't be having kids. I mean, this argument can go on, and there's just countless examples at this point in our society. So let's dive into the 1970s. So again, by this time, researchers had already estimated that the child porn market was at $1 billion. I mean, this was being fueled by the increase of sexualization happening in the media that was marketed and for children. And the point of children being sexualized, of course, is to make them more susceptible to sexual activity at a younger age. And we see this even today in cartoons, movies, books, magazine, fashion. All of it, is basically using a sexualized child, again, to attract attention and to make money. So, again, the roots of America, right? So, by the 1970s, the rates of adolescent pregnancy increased in America, and it was getting pretty wild. In 1978, the Department of Health reported that 9,000 babies were born to girls 11 years old and younger. Dr. Henry Giarretto, who was a psychiatrist who worked at the largest incest clinic in America during that time period in San Jose, California, reported that in 1978, he saw 600 new cases concerning juveniles who were escaping ancestral SA from their guardians or parents. Maybe it's their grandparents and uncles, who knows. But these were astronomical cases. And these kids, the incest led them to living on the streets and selling themselves for money, food, and a place to sleep. And the really scary thing about the ancestral, I think a lot of people assume that it only happens in those podunk towns in the South or, just somewhere in some isolated country area. But it's of high and low income status families. And I've been reading a book, and it goes through various reports throughout this case study. And so it's one story after another that you read, and it's all sorts of children from, middle class, upper class, lower class families. So, one cannot argue that it's simply a low income, inbred situation. And if you think about like the royal family, I think that validates that claim, and people wanting to maintain bloodlines and all of that weird stuff. So the statistics of children selling themselves on the streets in the 1970s reveal that 92% were victims of childhood SA, 67% were victims of incestual SA, and 70% of child drug addicts during that time period have reported various degrees of incestual SA. So based on my readings, again, it's clear that, these children were coming from all walks of life. It didn't matter, what gender they were, what age they were, all of these issues surrounding PDF files and incest, it was all stemming from this deviancy that was just overrunning America and perpetuating the pregnancy and the runaways and the addicts and the kids selling themselves on the streets. So, if you think about a dark energy that just starts taking over, it really, really just attacked the family units. And then from there, it created cycles of trauma and destruction that are still being perpetuated in different family lines to this very day. In 1974, the Youth Runaway Act was passed by Congress. This act led to more resources being allocated to help overburden law enforcement and social service agencies throughout the U.S. who were combating the consequential issues of youth runaways. So those consequential issues, of course, were kids selling themselves sexually. It was the drugs, it was the petty crimes, and it was also the children being used in gangs and other criminal organizations and networks. I had mentioned some of this in my previous video, but Los Angeles was seen as the epicenter of the child porn market in the 70s and the 80s. And let's be real, given the fact that Hollywood is established in that very area, in that very state, and we've seen what happens to a lot of child stars, especially, from the 70s and the 80s and, in the 40s and 50s, because it was so much more lawless back then, and there was less accountability due to the oversight of laws and regulations on different filming sets. And even in the music industry, right? You could just get away with a lot more things. But, the fact that Los Angeles was the epicenter of not only our movie industry and so much of our, entertainment industry and other facets, but there was also child porn going on. So just think about that. You have the above ground, you have the glamour, the glitz, the fun, the excitement, all of the advances that was happening in films and TV shows with special effects and just more attraction that people were getting and more emotional dependency they had on movies and TV shows and theaters just for that escapism, and the amount of money that was coming into California because of Hollywood in general with advertising and product endorsements and just the amount of wealth that different people were gaining there. And I think it just says so much. But then you have the below ground world, and there's a huge child porn market, and there's runaways on the streets of not only Los Angeles, but of course, Hollywood too. And all of this is happening at the same time. It really makes you look at things differently. But Los Angeles was also the location of the first juvenile vice unit in the United States. And this vice unit was, again, a product of the amount of youth runaways that were, happening all throughout major cities and, states throughout America. In 1976, the New York Port Authority and the New Jersey, launched the Youth Assistance Act. So during this time, New York had massive amounts of children who would arrive to the city by bus or train. And, traffickers and pimps and other criminal organizations had caught on to this happening. So at this point, they had a whole, method to essentially lure these kids who were getting off these trains and buses, not having any money, not even knowing where they were going to sleep, not having a job, possibly being too young to even get a job, not having any marketable skills. They were just escaping whatever environment they were coming from. So once they get off the trains and buses, the pimps or the traffickers come and they're like, hey, are you doing okay? I mean, do you need to talk to somebody? You look hungry. There's a diner right down the street. And the kid is just like, you know what, I am really hungry. So they go with the person, and the person actually feeds them because they want them to feel comfortable at first. And then after they feed them, next thing you know, they're being turned out in a matter of 36 hours. And their life is destroyed from that point on. I mean, hopefully their life recovers, but it'll never be the same, right? So aside from what was happening with runaway children and all that stuff, there was nefarious operations and organizations being established in America and abroad. And these organizations were operating on their constitutional right to organize and, freedom of speech, all that stuff. In 1975, in Great Britain, the organization known as PIE was established. And I absolutely hate this organization. It's just degrading, pie. But this PIA stood for PDF File Information Exchange. And this organization also has branches in America. I'm not sure how active those branches are, but I'm going to assume that they are very active, but they're just operating at more discrete levels. In 1978, NAMBLA, the North American Man-Boy Love Association, was established. Also in the 1970s, there was the Guion Society. Now, I don't think this group was as big as the PIE or NAMBLA, but the Guion Society had a motto that sex before 8 or it's too late. So these organizations had resources. They had massive networks in which they were exchanging information. They were coming together for conferences and meetings. And these members of these groups, they came from wealthy careers and occupations to help not only, put in funding for these organizations, but to lobby, to be impacting laws and various things in communities. And they would share so much information to the point where they had information they would send out explaining where they could go to find certain age groups of children who were selling themselves on the streets and what cities were good to go to. That's the kind of stuff that they were circulating during that time. And I haven't really worked at the stomach to really dive into the history of those groups. I don't know if I can. It's enraging, but it's also scary. But I'm also going to assume that because of the discretion that they operate at, how they were able to organize and how they've been able to sustain themselves, especially NAMBLA since 1978. And with technology, who knows, how they are sharing and what kind of information they have at this point. In my previous video, I mentioned Sergeant Lloyd Martin, who led that U.S. Juvenile Task Force, the very first one in America, in Los Angeles. So in the first month of this task force being established in 1976, they identified over 300 PDF files, operating in the Los Angeles area. And think about it. If this is an issue that isn't being widely identified, discussed, especially in the 1970s, and, you've just gotten to this point in society in which you have to establish a task force just to handle the amount of use on the streets and the crimes and the issues that are coming from that, this is probably like the most overwhelming. It feels like a disease outbreak. Like, I can't even imagine what it would have been like, especially without all of the technology advances that we have today to track people, to maintain our database of offenders and all of that other stuff. So Sergeant Lord Martin he was so overwhelmed. And he first realized that, the child ST was happening at the scale that it was in 1973 because he was initially working on the Vice Squad. So he was out in the streets, dealing with these runaways in the evening mostly. And he was able to, from talking with them and following his reports and all that stuff, he was able to understand the very pattern, the very model that Jeffrey Epstein and so many other pimps used to amass more victims for himself and, all of his high status clientele. So Sergeant Martin said one particular child would be seduced, that child would procure 2 more, those 2 would find 4, so it spread out very fast just from that single episode. We began to feel we were soon going to be facing a problem that was increasing like wildfire, a geometric progression. I see our morality sinking and our family structure going down as well. Isn't that terrifying? Because I don't even know where he was of all the incest stuff. But, he's probably seeing why are these parents just letting their kids be on the streets? And do they know that their child is now selling their bodies to PDF files? I mean, again, can you imagine being in that situation during that time period? So Sergeant Martin expressed some frustration when he said, other cities have not really faced up to the problem. They tell me it doesn't exist where they are. They say, it's too bad you have such a serious problem in Los Angeles. We feel sorry for you. Oh, can you imagine being gaslit? Because this man was fully aware of the fact that these kids just weren't all from California or from Los Angeles. He knew that they were coming from all sorts of places. He knew that they were moving back and forth from different cities and different states. He knew that this was a national problem. And most likely, I'm sure across his mind, this is an international problem. This has to be going on everywhere. So even in the 1970s, you had institutions ignoring a very evident problem. And given the fact that major PDF rings and involved so many people of high social status who held positions in communities and states in which they were supposed to be protecting the public, maintaining laws and structure and providing and supporting for families and children, you can only wonder who may have been a part of covering up some of these rings that he encountered and just gaslit him right in his face. I mean, I would have gotten so mad. So, and again, you think about this too, this problem was already so massive at this point, Congress had to allocate funds to states to combat the issues of children being on the streets, selling themselves, committing other petty crimes and joining gangs and all that other stuff. And at this point, it just seems like no matter how many PDF rings were being uncovered, somehow someone in power would put the fire out. The ashes would scatter, the public would remember, but most didn't see the reality of exploited children like law enforcement, social workers, coroners, and mental health workers. So the first big PDF ring that got exposed was in the 1970s in Revere, Massachusetts. It was a cowboy ring with over 250 boy S-workers. The starting rate for services was about $50. All a person had to do was make a phone call, and apparently within a matter of 30 minutes or so, a child would be on that individual's doorstep. The purveyors, who were selling these children were a child psychiatrist, headmasters of exclusive New England schools, and administrators of state institutions. So the very people who are supposed to be protecting, uplifting children were the ones who were destroying their lives, destroying their mental health, any sense of trust, any sense of normalcy, any sense of structure that not only they have in their daily lives, but what they see society as. And I've talked about this before, but once you have a victim who's been victimized by, let's say, a police officer or a priest or a Boy Scouts leader or, a teacher, someone in the military, it distorts their perception of who is good, who is bad. And it really fractures something, not only, you know, in their mind, but in their spirit too. And it really creates a massive amount of dissociation from reality, because you just don't know what to make of what you're experiencing in life. And most people around you cannot say that they are experiencing the same thing. And given the fact that we're still dealing with this Epstein saga, and we've had a long history of PDF rings in America that, involved powerful people who, hold positions of community service and public welfare and all that stuff, it really makes you think that it really makes it evident that, so little has changed. And can you imagine being a victim in the 70s or the 80s and knowing that there's really no one you can tell, you don't know who to go to, who will believe you? Because, it's 2026 and it's taken people a long time to believe that, people in really high positions of power in our society, presidential power, could be a part of something like this. So I just want to go over a few examples of some of these other PDF rings. And I've mentioned them before, but I'm going to keep mentioning them until either people, find some books, do their own research about these cases. But I also just want to express and make sure people know that this is a pattern that's been going on very evidently since the 1970s. So again, I always mention the Franklin scandal that came out of Nebraska, and that involved, major financial institutions, people who worked in the school system, police officers, a police chief. This case made its way all the way to, the presidential office. It implicated George Bush Sr. And one of the, child victims in this case was trafficked to an elite party in Washington, D.C. And this party was so elite that even, so I guess all the people who were attending had these special IDs that they had to show once they went into the parties. And even, the president had to show this special ID that he was who he was. And at this party, there were a bunch of men. There were children, and there were young female, I wouldn't say young, there was young adult female sex workers at the party too. And this victim didn't see George Bush Sr. engaging in any illegal activity, but if you read Kathy O'Brien's book, Transformation of America, she implicates George Bush Sr., and she even talks about George Bush Jr. as well. And what's really interesting about her perspective of George Bush Jr. was that she saw him as a fellow victim of MK Ultra, which I want you to think about what that implicates, the fact that, a president would have to go under MK Ultra. And we know George Bush Jr. comes from the Skull and Bones Society and those other Masonic ties, so the brainwashing there is deep and heavy. But think about that. A president having to undergo MK Ultra, mind control. And think about what that might look like at this point in 2026. But I don't want to get too off track, but the Franklin scandal involved some of the most powerful people, and the saddest thing about this case is those powerful people were never held accountable for the well-documented and well-reported and evidence-based crimes against children. And the even more raging part was that some of the victims who spoke out were, basically put into prison for some ridiculous charges. And they were accused of lying on the stand and committing perjury. And if you read The Franklin Scandal, it's a book by John DeCamp, who was a legislator and a lawyer who was initially investigating financial fraud in the Franklin, Financial Institute. It was one of their credit unions, the Franklin Credit Union. And that's what he was investigating. And then through this investigation, they stumble upon the PDF rings. And eventually, John became so involved that he started helping the victims who were being accused of perjury, and who were put into prison because of that. So it's a really good book. It's very hard to read. And I say that because, it goes into great detail about what these kids experienced. And when it comes to these survivor books, I don't know, unless you have dealt with a lot of this stuff, you probably won't read it through all in one sitting, because it's the most deplorable, inhumane, degrading, demonic things that these children had to experience, and what they went through, and what Kathy O'Brien went through, and other MK Ultra survivors like Bryce Taylor or Wendy Hoffman. It is, I don't even have words for it. It's just a warning if you ever read any of these books. Anyway, so let's get back to this timeline of cases. So there's also the Boy Scouts Troop 137 case that took place in New Orleans. And this occurred in the 1970s and 1980s as well. And this case involved, people who worked in churches, school officials, Boy Scouts leaders, of course. And I mentioned how these Boy Scouts leaders would go into low-income neighborhoods and look for single mothers who had boys. And from there, they would con their way into the household, and eventually got to the point where these Boy Scouts troop leaders were able to take these boys on overnight trips where they were basically being pimped out at these parties in various locations. There's also the North Fox Island case out in Michigan. And this case was 1970s, 1980s, huge PDF ring that involved some very powerful people who worked in various positions of power throughout Michigan, and other powerful people from the country as well. And that's one case I still really need to dive into, and I think the impact of that case is still evident because I came across an article yesterday in which there was a, can I say so many, sorry, I'm thinking of YouTube censorship, but there was a man who committed deletion, I haven't thought of a good word for criminal stuff yet, anyways, but he may have been a victim of the North Fox Island, so I'm going to be looking into that. But yeah, that's another big case. And I also want to mention the Catholic Church, because to me, they're not a religious institution. They're just a wealthy, powerful, and untaxed organization that holds a lot of social, political power on an international level. And what enrages me about the Catholic Church is the amount of historical artifacts and evidence they get to retain. And if you know anything about the Jesuit order and how basically that was like the CIA for the Catholic Church, and the Catholic Church has been connected to Italian mafias. I mean, the history of the Catholic Church is so deep and so nefarious, but what is very true is that they have protected hundreds and hundreds of PDF files, and they have silenced victims. They have, buried so many stories and cases, and I don't know if I'll ever be able to reconcile my feelings with the Catholic Church. But I have to mention that because to me, that is a big PDF ring. If we want to talk about the MK Ultra, the mind control experiments that were, orchestrated, sanctioned and run by the CIA, the military, the American military, and that through those programs, there was massive amounts of sanctioned child SA and ST. That's something that we have to acknowledge. And I think that's why a lot of the Epstein files are trickling out slowly. It's not just the fact that our president is implicated in these files. It's that massive government operations that, were secret for so long. And even when the MK Ultra studies and the victims were suing the government and all that stuff was coming out, they destroyed a lot of files. So I think a lot of that stuff is connected. And now that I know that Jeffrey Epstein was so involved with not only orchestrating various things and, pop culture and Bitcoin and the QAnon, I feel like I know for a fact that this man was also involved in mind control. And I mean, we've heard about the breeding farms and all of that stuff concerning him, and I'm sure that's in some of the files, but I've watched interviews with survivors talking about the breeding farms and Jeffrey Epstein being involved in that. So all the mind control, I just feel like he's deeply involved in that as well. And so if we're going to talk about the Epstein saga, we have to talk about the mind control. And that's something that our government really doesn't want to come to light. So yeah, it's 2026, and I really can't figure out what has changed from 1970 to 2026. It feels like, again, we're in this same cycle. And if you know anything about like spiritual development and healing and, breaking through generational patterns and just any other pattern or habits that you're trying to break free of in your life, you know that you're going to experience the same issue, but it's going to be different people, different faces, different settings, but the same themes are going to be recurring. I think that's what we're experiencing. And even Epstein is just a repeating figure in American history, but he's just operated at a greater level of wealth, influence, and authority. And whether he is, I say is because, yeah, I do think he could be alive, but, that's a whole nother rabbit hole. But whether he is an Israeli spy, or whether he was working for the CIA, or whether he's a shape-shifting demon, which, to do the things that he's done, you'd have to have some demonic energy operating through you. So I'm not discounting that, but it blows my mind. And I really hope that we can break free and actually reach another level of getting through this cycle that we have been in for so long. And if you watched my previous episode, I've talked about some of the historical evidence of, child ST, globally. And that's like from ancient Greece, to American slavery in the 1600s and to being where we're at now. And all of it's just been a replication and an evolution of one sadistic, operation to another. It's when you think about all of that, which is why I'm trying to go into all this history. I could keep it esoteric and talk about the reality of energetic and spiritual warfare and how all of this is just demonic forces that are operating through, vessels and physical beings, and they're creating chaos, pain, trauma, darkness, fear, and they are feeding off that energy, and they're feeding off the essence and innocence of children. I had recently seen a clip of this priest, who I think is pretty popular, but I can't think of his name, but he was saying how blood is light, and I feel like that makes so much sense when you think about Aleister Crowley and the sex magic and the victimization of children through sex magic, and why, kids are being trafficked and harmed and tortured, and cannibalism and all of those other weird things. But I think it makes so much sense, because if you are someone who is engaging and, being a part of these nefarious operations and crimes against children, you are so cut off from God. You are so cut off from, light energy, the healing, the carefree essence, and the harmony, just the higher vibration that you get to operate and live at. You're going to still need some amount of sustenance to sustain you. So they need the blood, they need the light. So I'm going to get into that more and find that interview clip, and I'll talk about that. But I thought that was so interesting, and I think it makes a lot of sense. But if you think about Epstein and where we're at now, and how the government is going to move as far as like quieting this matter or distracting us, of course they have their pawns, but the government essentially has to create another problem that only they can solve, right? And maybe that problem is going to be war or economic collapse or the end of democracy. We'll all be so worried about, feeding ourselves and shelter, our basic necessities, food, water, shelter, that we won't have enough energy and capacity to actually think about, what's going on with the Epstein case. So again, it's like that breadcrumbing, and they just want us to ultimately to become so overwhelmed with all the other problems going on with ICE and our workforce and AI taking over and, drug epidemics still happening. I mean, the amount of problems in America is endless, and a lot of it has been so institutionally orchestrated, right? I want to mention Jay-Z before I wrap this up, but Sloan Bella, I have to go rewatch the episodes that she did about Jay-Z, but I do believe Jay-Z is going to be the next pawn on the chopping block, and it will be interesting to see how Beyonce responds, because at this point, like so many victims who end up with traffickers or, PDF files, often these victims get so embedded into that world that they too become perpetrators. And, there's the Johnny Gosch case. I don't want to go off on too many tangents, but either Beyonce is going to divorce Jay-Z and present herself as a victim of what she's lived through and experienced, or she's going to go down with him. Those are her two options there. But either way, their money is connected. Their reputations are connected. And if you think about the spiritual bond of marriage and all that stuff, it's that deeply connected. They're that tied to each other now. So again, be careful who you have children with and who you marry, right? But I think Jay-Z would be the next pawn sacrificed. And in this great game of black and white chess, the Masonic chess, right? There's going to be enough media attention, from the next pawn, whether that's Jay-Z or somebody else, to distract from the higher levels, the true bloodlines, those 13 families that are connected to the Nephilim race, right? If you guys have dived into that history and the elite bloodlines and all that stuff, they will never come to justice. We don't even see them in the public. You don't see them in magazines or newspapers or anything like that. We don't see about these people. We don't hear about these people. We don't even know how many family members are in their families or anything like that. They stay in the shadows. But so we'll see what happens. But Sleepyheads, this is the first installment of my series, The Proliferation, Child ST in America, 1970s to the 1990s. I'm going to be diving into various aspects of the PDF rings from that time period, whistleblowers, people who were investigating, who were unalived, who were defamed, discredited publicly. I'm going to be, just connecting a lot of those dots because it really is all tied together at the end of the day. And again, that time period, the 1970s to the 1990s, it was the pivotal construction and foundation for what Child ST in America is, based on what I've researched, based on what I believe. And of course, with technology and the methods and practices, everything's always changing, but what hasn't is the reach that powerful people in our society have and the fragility of childhood. And at this point, it feels like childhood is just disappearing because, think about the fact that there's, 14-year-olds, 15-year-olds who are acting like they're sophomores in college, who are looking like they're sophomores in college, who are going on right after high school to get plastic surgery or Botox, who are so focused on outwardly physical development that they have no sense of spiritual or emotional development. We are disconnected from the very roots of, our spiritual evolution. And there's so much to it. I don't want to go off another tangent as I'm trying to wrap this up, but you guys know what I mean. Childhood seems very lost in this society. But thank you so much for tuning in. Please be sure to like, share, and subscribe. Comment below. Let me know what you think about this episode, what you found interesting about what I've discussed. I'm really happy to be, putting out these newer episodes because it's a lot of reading I have to do. It's a lot of research. I try not to talk about things, especially concerning these historical facts that I haven't actually, read about or understood myself. And again, a lot of these books about these cases and even the news articles from, the 1970s and 1980s, they're hard to get through. They are depressing. It is very sad. And when you see where we're at now as a society, and it's not too different from how things were in the 1970s as far as, putting these people, these offenders away and cleaning up our government and our institutions. It's very sad. It's very disheartening. But Sleepyheads, I hope you have a great night. It has been so good to talk to you, and I promise I will talk again with you soon. Bye, Sleepyheads.